Hey everyone, welcome back to the Mean Show. I have a very special episode for you today. We are going to feature, I don't know why I say we, it's just me. So I am going to feature the first man who's ever been on the show. He is, obviously he's special if he's going to be on the Mean Show because it's usually all women. And the reason I really wanted to feature him is because during COVID, he decided to use his platform, which is the Downtown Writers Jam podcast, which I've been a guest on. I will include a link to our interview in the show notes. He decided to take it upon himself to interview female authors who were publishing during COVID. And because it was during COVID, they could not promote their book the way they had planned to. They could not do book tours. They could not go around in person and hold events to promote their book. And that is a very big blow to any author of a book, because that's a big way that authors get their name out there and get their book out there. So I just think what he did was very cool, very generous. He's a really good guy. And Brad and I are good friends. We've known each other for a very long time. We worked together, I think, like in the early 2000s at wired.com. We were both reporters. I was covering biotechnology and science, and Brad was covering music. And this was when MP3s were like new, like a big deal. And there were a lot of copyright issues. He did a lot of really fun interviews with musical celebrities, and he was extremely prolific. Everyone else in the newsroom was always mad at him for making us look bad because he'd publish like 18 stories a day and we'd do like, for me, I would do one, like a few a week. I was like probably the least productive reporter in the newsroom. And he was the most productive, but he was a really fun guy to work with. And I'm really grateful that we are still friends. And I just thought he was really worthy of featuring as the first man on the Mean Show because of what he's done for female authors. He doesn't like me to call him a feminist, but he's probably a better feminist than I am. He's very knowledgeable about feminist literature. He's just very informed, smart, and fun to listen to. He's hilarious. So, without further ado, I really hope you enjoy my interview with Brad King. Brad King, welcome to the Mean Show.
Hi, KP. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good.
Thank you so much for being the first man on the Mean Show.
It only took you 3 months to convince me to do this.
I know, I know. And I know that you're hesitant, so we really appreciate it. I'm so glad that we've stayed in touch all these years and that we're having this opportunity. I was lucky enough to be on your podcast, and I was very grateful for that. And Brad has a podcast called the Downtown Writers Jam podcast. Is that the correct way
You
to say
got
the
it.
name? Okay. And it's awesome. You should go check it out. And he's also, while I'm at it, talking about what you do. You are the editorial director of ETC Press at Carnegie Mellon,
You're doing
and
good.
that stands for. I looked it up. It stands for Entertainment Technology Center.
You got it. So it's the place. If like I don't know if you've seen it, but a while ago, maybe 10 years ago, there was a video that came out called "The Last Lecture" by a guy named Randy Pausch that became a New York
Hmm.
Times best-selling book. It was a lecture series at Carnegie Mellon for people that were originally were retiring. What would your last lecture be? And Randy was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and so that was his last lecture, and it went on to become this phenomenon for several years. He co-founded the place that I work, and my friend became the director after that. So that's like this place is sort of like one of those like
Wow.
weird iconic digital maker places.
That is so cool. I did not know that, and that is really, really cool.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's it when you
Amazing.
watched if you watch the
Um,
video, like, you will be weeping uncontrollably. Um,
I will definitely be crying.
yeah, because I don't want to spoil it, but the lecture is not for college kids.
It's not for college kids, okay.
It is given at a college, but at the end of the thing, you realize like, oh, I know who this last lecture was for, and it was not for us.
Got it, okay. Oh, wow, okay, I'm excited, but scared to go watch it now. Um, and it's also in my home state of Pennsylvania, so I'm excited. I'm gonna get to see you this summer when I go visit my dad.
I mean, if you remember to let me know you're coming to town.
I won't forget, I won't forget. The reason why I wanted to have you on the show is because you have been extremely supportive of women, like, for a really long time, but in particular since the pandemic started, you decided to feature mostly, I would say the majority, right? I mean, almost all of the writers that you have featured have been women who were publishing books during the pandemic and who, had planned to have book tours, et cetera, couldn't do their promo tours anymore, couldn't do any kind of press. So you were giving them a place to talk about what they were working on or what they were publishing. So I'm curious to hear more about that. What inspired you to do that?
So I actually started a version of this show when I was at Wired. Jeremy Barna, who has since passed away, he and there was this, if you remember, I mean, I know you remember, there was a studio in the back that nobody used. And George Shirk,
It was, like, incredible.
yeah, and George Shirk, who was the editor, like came to me one day and was like, we should do a thing. And I was like, super, great. So we did not listen to what George wanted to do. And Jeremy and I were like, well, I bet we can get anybody on this show. So we just were like, let's just see who we can get. And we had George Carlin and Grandmaster Flash and Scott Bakula. We had all these people that were on, and I would not interview them about what they were doing. Like I was really interested in who they were as people. And so the genesis of the show sort of started back then when it was streaming audio and downloadable audio. I had restarted it again in 2014. I had left the media, was in Indiana, and I had never been in a place where I didn't have a big writing community. So I started this writing collective and ended up with four other partners who happened to be women. That was just sort of a happenstance. They happened to be very good at the things that I was very bad at, and so one was like a playwright. One was a fiction writer. You know, it was like things that I don't do. And I was like, oh well, let's all get together. By the end, we had about 450 people in this collective, and we did writing retreats and like weekly retreats. We published books. We published literary magazines, and I was like, well, I'm going to start this show again, which we did. And over the course of the last couple years, when I moved to Pittsburgh, I thought, well, I was doing it sporadically. Maybe I should do this a little more less sporadic. The pandemic hits right after I had decided to go from like one or two shows a month to two shows a week. And the pandemic hits, everything shuts down. And I didn't really have a reach into the PR world or any of that stuff. And I just started tweeting to people and going into Facebook groups and like looking for people that didn't come from the big five publishers. Like that was initially because I had interviewed my friends and my friends were all well known writers. And I'm like, well, I don't just want to do that. I want to interview this diverse cross section of people. And before I knew it, when you're doing two shows a week and everything shut down, people from all over the world wanted to be on the show, which was really cool. And initially, I did a bad job of sort of tracking diversity across different metrics because it was just like all of a sudden somebody turned on a fire hose and I was getting squirted in the face. And I'm like, I don't know what's happening. Like, who are all these people? And then sort of got the spreadsheet together and was like, okay, let's make sure we have like people of various ages, people from, who are both at big publishing houses and people who self-publish, people from other countries and not just Americans. Like, and I tried very hard to not have a bunch of dudes that look like me. So that was sort of the initial diversity move was like, no people that look like me. And I've interviewed some men and things like that. Like I'm not against that, but it just sort of like I ended up with this sort of really nice cross section of like people from around the world, many of whom happen to be women. Um, and it's been fantastic because I read all kinds of stuff. Like I'm not one of those people that's like, well, I'm a guy, I only read science fiction. So like I'm interested in people who write and the stories that they tell. So for me, that was just a natural sort of evolution of like what the show should be. And I'm still not, I mean, if I'm honest with everybody, like I don't do a great job with all the diversity metrics, like because it's just me. And I try very hard. And that's all I can really do is like try to make sure that I'm not getting the same kind of person over and over and over and over again. Like whether it be a white woman from America, you know what I mean? Like I don't want it to be like 35 to 50 white women, and that's 90% of who I have. Like I'm trying really hard to get people from all different backgrounds and all different ethnicities and all different genders and all that kind of stuff, because that makes for a much more interesting show.
Yeah. Well, you've had some really, really interesting I mean, all your interviews are interesting because you're such a good interviewer. Like, you have to go listen to this guy's interviewing skills. He's so good. Um, but do you have like any favorites? Is that sort of like choosing a favorite child? Do you have any of your favorite?
No, in fact, I'm also like of that Gen X where I'm like, nope, there are favorites. I will say like I've told people I've never had a bad interview. Like I've just never had a bad interview. Some of that is because I am a good interviewer, and some of that is because everybody has an interesting story if you know how to get to it. The first person that I had on the show when we joined the Solid Listen Network was a woman named Allison Wood, who wrote a book called Being Lolita. And it's about,
She was on my show too
yeah,
because
I
of
think I
you.
sent her to you. Uh,
And she was kind of too young to be on my show, but I was like, I don't care. You're amazing.
yeah. And her book is about being this relationship that she had with a high school teacher who groomed her. Um, But what was really fascinating about the interview was like that's an important story and that's one that needs to be told. And like I wanted to give platform to that. And it's probably one of the worst interviews I did because as I told her later, I was trying to not ask questions because the last thing you need is like a filter of me, like, well, hang on, tell me about like I wanted her to have a platform to talk about her stuff. But there were so many other things that have happened in her life around that, right? With the assault and things like that. It was just such a powerful interview because it's a reminder that like we write these nonfiction books, we write these books, but they're only a part of the story, right? Like you read a memoir and you're like, I've read this person's life story. And then you talk to them and you're like, I have not read this person's life story at all. I've read a sliver of that story. And so sort of seeing the aftermath of that stuff and how it led to other bad things happening in her life was just like, again, like you as a man, I know these things happen. But then hearing it is just like, fuck, like, are you kidding me? Like, and like, how are you still a decent person who's going through the world and like trying to help people? Like, you're just a better person than I'll ever be. So that like that one was really good. I interviewed a woman named Sarah Casbier who wrote A Woman, a Plan, an Outline of a Man. And this is going to sound like I only interview women that write things that are about uh, sexual assault and things. And that is not I have some other ones that are also good. But this one was so good because many of these memoirs talk about the sort of immediate aftermath. And this book, which is a book of essays, and Sarah's just fantastic, um, is about the 25 years later and like what happens when you're in a relationship with somebody and like how does that assault impact them because the person has been changed forever and now their partner has to deal with that and like what's the aftermath for like trauma therapy, like what is it that you go through to actually just be able to get up and move through the world. And I thought that was one of the most important books because it wasn't about the event, it was about the ripples through time that we just are not good at talking about, or at least men are like whatever we as a people are not good about talking about it in public. Men certainly are rarely involved in that conversation, and this just felt like one of those, oh, I get to sit with this woman like I'm a girlfriend, and this book is her telling me that ripple. So I thought like those two are like some of my favorite interviews, and I got done and was just like, holy crap. Whitney Hill, who's a black author who self-publishes this science fiction fantasy stuff, and she's fantastic and has like 5 books, and just keeps like they keep getting more and more recognized. I think the last book got a Kirkus review, so like she's just fantastic and is like, uh, it's really fascinating And it's such a fun story as a writer who, like, in this time when it's hard to be a writer, she is building this career because she couldn't get big publishers to like publish a book with a black woman as the center of a fantasy piece, and so she made her own thing. uh and I get annoyed with her because like we became friends, and like I'm like, hey, like, you want to talk next week? And she's like, I'm writing, it's 6 weeks till I can talk to you. And I'm like, okay. Like, because she's so on a mission to like, and she is like
Dedicated.
unrelenting in terms of like, she will not put anything else off because this is what she wants to do. So like I've had people like that are just like, and all of them are like, I don't really know if my story is interesting. And I'm like, okay, that shit's really interesting.
It actually is really freaking interesting.
Yeah.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I've had fun. Like I had Gina Barreca, who I don't know if you had on the show, but like she's a big, like, she does a lot of comedy writing, and she's edited a bunch of like books with, badass feminist women. And she was a hoot. Like, I don't even know what her last book is about, but I know we talked for an hour and 15 minutes and laughed our asses off. And she's like, this Italian woman who like grew up in this super Italian family. And like,
Yes, she was
she's
amazing. I
amazing.
loved that interview so
Yeah.
much. I loved it, and she was a little older too, right? She was maybe in her 50s or
Yeah, I try not to guess those things. I'm 49, she's older than me.
okay. Okay, but yeah, I loved her perspective, and she was hilarious
Yeah,
with her family, her Italian family, and all the how the aunts would, like, make fun of their husbands, like, in the kitchen, and then, have this whole ruse once they got out into dinner, they'd be like like, that they got the
it was
meat
the
from the
meat.
other butcher
Yeah.
that of the
One of the husbands was like, "I can tell what butcher this came from," and they're like, "Okay." So
Oh,
they
yeah.
went and bought meat from another butcher, and he's like, "Ah, my favorite meat," and they're like, "Yeah, okay, like whatever."
Yeah. You're full of shit.
Yeah, so it was a whole bunch of stories
That is
about
so
that, and it
funny.
was like part of the reason I do the interview the way that I do, and for people that don't know, it's a little bit like I like to say inside the actor studio, and Mark Maron stole my shtick before I started doing it. Like we literally
Uh,
walk through the lives of people. So the first half of the interview is generally like before they were in college. So you're hearing all of these foundational stories of these people and like how did they become the personality that then became the vessel for what they wrote. And with Gina, it was just like, oh shit, like I want to read all of your stuff.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's really interesting that you do it that way because it makes for an interview that's not gonna be anywhere else. I don't really know of anybody else doing interviews that way, and a lot of interviews end up being kind of the same information. And so it's like gonna be stuff that, you don't get anywhere else. I love it. And it's fun. It was I mean, at least for me, being on your show was really fun because, like, just, people love talking about themselves, and you get to talk about yourself, like, your childhood and, like, how you were brought up and all that stuff is, like, it can be scary to talk about a little bit, but it's also, like, fun to talk about yourself in that way. I I don't know, maybe I'm just self-centered.
But I mean, to be a writer, self-centered, right? Like to sit down and be like, I have a thing that people should hear. Like it's like it doesn't. Whenever anybody's like, I don't know, and I'm like, listen, we do this, and there's a certain amount of narcissism and arrogance that comes with being a writer.
Yes.
And my issue throughout my life had been that I started to believe that stuff, right? And being a white dude in America, like there was no rails telling me like, hey, that's not right and that's not true. And so, I mean, part of my reluctance to be on the show we've talked about is because I always get a little bit nervous whenever white guys start talking about like being an ally or like whatever, like instead of just like doing this stuff to get better because I for a long time I don't know if I know for a fact that wasn't the person that I wanted to be. And it comes from trauma and it comes from damage from my childhood and things that happened, but the reality is I needed to fix that because as I tell people, like, men are weapons. Like we have not realized that we're weapons, and that means that we have to take a great care for the ways in which we are loaded and the ways in which we go off. And that's incumbent upon us to deal with that. And so the last 4 or 5 years in therapy has been trauma therapy and sort of dealing with those things so that I have better reactions and do things better. And it's actually made writing more difficult because it is a stripping down of all those things that make you be able to put something on a page. And now everything is like, do I need to do that? Like, do I need to say that? So I enjoy the conversations with writers because I love writing, and writing is to me very, very important and saved my life and all of these kinds of things, even as I'm not able to do it right now. I think at some point I'll be able to, but like the trauma of therapy, dealing with trauma, has made it has undercut, I think, the thing that it takes to be a writer, which is this. I say arrogance, but I don't mean it in a pejorative way. But like, I have something to say and it needs to be said to an audience requires a certain amount of something inside you.
Right. But maybe it's the thing that you thought it took to be a writer, but that's not universally true necessarily. It's just that you have to shift your way of thinking about what it means for you to be a writer and how you can access that part of yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I am not a believer in the like trauma of the artist, right? Like you can only make great art if you're miserable. Like I don't
If you're suffering,
Yeah,
yeah.
like I don't believe that. But to me it is like writing is about a voice. It is about having a thing that you feel the need to say, right? That you want to get out. And right now the thing that I want to get out is this trauma. Like I don't really have there are things that I want to say, but I'm not like quite sure where I fit into the new world of what I should and shouldn't say. Like where do I have an ability to write and to talk about things? When is it my job just to sort of sit back and listen? I mean, I always tell people like, white guys had a good run. Like, I'm not sure if like now is the time to be like, I need to inject myself into this conversation, right? Like, and so because I had been a weapon for so long, and because I had been um, not always the kindest person, not always a supportive, like not always the person that I wanted to be. I think I was always a nice person, but I wasn't the person that I wanted to be. Like that's sort of where my focus is, and I just haven't really been able to sit down and write really in like 5 years, which is terrible because I have a finished book that needs to be edited.
Wow. Well, so if you wrote that book though 5 years ago, I imagine you probably have a lot of changes you wanna make after going through the therapy and rethinking your whole your whole identity sort of, or I don't know if it's your identity or
Yeah, I don't know if it's my identity either. I think, I always tell my therapist, I feel like I'm the person that I was when I was a kid and not the person that I became once for people that don't know, like I'm from a small Appalachian town. Like we were, didn't have a lot of money. Um, and I made it to Berkeley. I worked at Wired, but like I had to work 3 jobs when I was in graduate school. Like I worked a full-time job and a part-time job, and I freelanced just so that I could go to school. And so there was a lot of residual anger. And I've told folks like, yeah, I had it on the easy setting of the video game, like white guy. Like at the end of the day, like I had a lot of things that made that path a little bit easier. But when you're a poor kid from nowhere in America, it's still hard. And so I had been fighting my whole life, and I never knew a time that fighting wasn't a thing. And then you get in the world and you're like, that's not a thing. Right. But like that was the only way I knew how to get by. And I'm not even talking about fisticuffs, although there was some fisticuffs along the way, but it was just like nobody was going to get in my way of me getting out. And that's just a terrible way to live, like for a lot of reasons. So, it has been when I wrote the book was always supposed to be my family's sort of infamous in America. And the book was always supposed to answer the question that everybody asked me, which is why do those people in Appalachia vote against their self interest? And so I wanted to tell this story. I got my family history back to the 1300s. We came from, England. We were part of the rural court, like helped make the Kentucky long rifle, like settled parts of Appalachia, and like North Carolina, Kentucky. And then it's one of the poorest
wow.
places in the country now. And it's poor
Yeah.
because of Democrats. And so the book was really a rumination on both like this sort of anger of poor working class whites in that area. But I always told people it was an explanation, not a justification. but it was a look, this thing exists. And then sort of looking at the forces around it as a non-historian to say, like, look, this is designed this way. It's designed to keep us from talking to Black people. It's designed to put us at odds with them. It's designed for us to think white nationalism is helping us because of the systems of capitalism and feudalist, post Reconstruction stuff. But it's a book of essays. Like, it's not a historical book. It's a book of my family and how this rich family became this poor family, who had, people, most of my relatives were either murdered or like died alone in trailer parks and stuff like that. So figuring out what I actually want to say around that has become that has changed through trauma therapy, because I've always been very cognizant of like race and gender and sexuality have, those are things that I can't talk about in any sort of like definitive way other than to acknowledge that they exist as a thing, right? And like, I'm on the easy setting. I can't talk about what it's like to be Black in Appalachia. Like, go read Bell Hooks. Like, she's really good at explaining that to everybody. So that's what I've been struggling with, is like, where does that, because people immediately go to JD Vance, who, and I know JD, but like, this is a different book. Like, it's not that. Like, it's also not the whole slew of books that came out shitting on JD, because I find those equally annoying, because I'm like, it's it assumes there's one narrative in this place with 25 million people, and there's not. There's many narratives that are there. And so, that's been the difficult thing for me, like going back to try to figure out, like, where is my lane in this and what is it that I actually want to say?
And it's really, I think it's really important, and I think it's gonna be so valuable to you in the long run that you are being so thoughtful about it, that you're not, that you're not just sort of like, "Oh, I have a book. It's,"
Yeah.
could I mean, it could be just, because the timing, you could feel like it's good and let's just go for it, but you're being very, like I said, thoughtful. And also, I just wanted to mention, just I'm sure people know who JD Vance is, but just in case, he wrote Hillbilly Elegy, right?
Hillbilly Elegy. Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanna make sure
Yeah.
I even had it right. Yeah.
And
And
like, that book is from, like, literally the town is where my first girlfriend's from. So like, when people are talking about the book and JD, I'm like, you cannot like JD, but like, I mean, I've been to that town, and that's a pretty, like, it's the cultural analysis of what makes people poor is what people are really upset about. He basically writes a book where he's like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and stop doing drugs, hillbillies. And we're like, well, I mean, we didn't make Oxycontin, like, all of a sudden, like,
exactly.
I can go down to Clay County, and like, my cousin took me, and we literally watched boxes of pills coming out the back of a warehouse. And he's like, this is just what happens here. Like, I, I was
Oh my
just,
god.
so that didn't come from us.
Yeah. And so you mentioned something a couple minutes ago that I just wanted to touch back on, and you said that your family and families like yours became poorer because of Democrats. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Because think people are gonna be like, "Oh, what?
Yeah.
Tell me more."
So it, the two places that I talk about in the book are West Virginia and Kentucky, because the mineral owning land in both of those places, 75% of that land was owned by nine. In Kentucky, it was nine families. In West Virginia, I think it was nine companies. And the nine families in Kentucky were largely Democrats. And those families essentially siphoned money off of the natural resources of the land, and then they would sell those rights to people that were outside of the region. So all of the sort of natural resources of the area were being sold off. And my family and the Whites, which was the other family there, and there were some other families involved, but were the well-to-do families that had founded Clay County. And then as these other folks went to Lexington and started to say, like, hey, there's money here and we can profit off of this, like, they would build like a railroad to Clay County. But as soon as like the timber wasn't a thing anymore, as soon as salt wasn't anymore, they would not keep the railroad up, and it would fall into disrepair and it would stop being used, right? So the infrastructures that were being built around that were literally used to extract the money. And then as soon as that wealth was gone, they left those places without infrastructures that would allow them to build in other ways. And so If you go to the place where my family's from on Crane Creek, and it's Lower Crane Creek, because if you go to Upper Crane Creek, that's the whites, but down to where we were, the same families are on Crane Creek that were there in 1804 when it was founded. And that place was founded in my family's home. That home is still there. So 300 years later, if you're a Democrat and you show up there and you're like, I'd like to help you. Well, they've been telling stories for 300 years, right? Like that doesn't go away. If I go down there, I can tell people like, "Oh, I'm Baldy Baker's, you know, great times four grandson," and they're like, "Oh," and I'm like, "Yeah, I came down through Bad Tom and then Virgie," and they're like, "Oh yeah," they know wwho I am, like that. So trying to explain that to a world is really difficult because if you haven't experienced that, like that's some crazy stuff, right? Like it feels like it's from a different time, and I'm like, yeah, it's from a time that remembers.
Yeah. So they were abandoned. They were abandoned by they like just if they had nothing to offer, they basically financially or with the goods or whatever, they abandoned the railroad and they were just stranded.
Yeah, and the roads weren't built up, and like all of those natural infrastructures weren't built. And the same thing happened in West Virginia. They strip mined everything. So there's this in 1965, after Kennedy was killed, the Appalachian Regional Commission was formed. That was sort of part of his legacy. And they put forth four things that needed to be done in Appalachia to make sure, as this new highway system went in, the Eisenhower Highway system that everybody drives around on, that pulled everybody out of the state routes, which was the lifeblood of Appalachia. And part of what they said needed to be done was build around natural resources and things of that nature. All of the stuff that had failed in the 1800s because they hadn't built the infrastructures into those places. I wrote about it at Wired, and one of our editors, he who will not be named, would I wrote three stories, and he said, "I'm never going to let you write another story about Appalachia." It's like nobody cares. And I was like, that is like the microcosm of that area. And what's happened is this sort of because it's not people think it's a Republican stronghold. It's not. They hate everybody. They don't trust anybody that's going to come in and try to help them because the only thing that's ever happened
Yeah.
is people have taken from them. And so, and this is, I mean, this is not a homogenous place. Like, it's not just like white people that are there. Like, this is like if you look at the actual, if you like don't suppress the vote, it's it's a lot more diverse than people, but it doesn't make a difference. If you've been left behind, you don't necessarily trust people that say they're going to help. You got to go in and prove it. You can't just say you want to help.
Yeah. Yeah. And so are they not voting?
Um, no, I mean, like at least Clay tends to go towards. I mean, it went towards Trump. I think the last time. I don't know if you ask me what the percentage of people that voted in the county. I don't know. I wouldn't guess it's very high. Yeah, I don't know if you remember a
Mhm.
few years ago, there was a census worker that was apparently murdered in Clay County. It was national news. And it ended up that the census worker had committed suicide because he was hoping that his wife and kids would get the insurance payout. And the reason he did it in Clay County was and Clay is where my family is ancestrally from, is oftentimes considered the most anti-government place in the country. And so he went there because he thought, well, people will just assume I've been killed as a census worker.
Wow. Wow. That's intense. Oh my god.
Yeah.
Well, do you remember I don't know if I know we've talked about this a while ago, but when I went to Appalachia and wrote about the Melungeons,
Oh, yeah. In fact, I was about to write about it yesterday and I didn't.
you were going to write about the Melungeons?
I was just referencing as people were talking about diversity in Appalachia. I'm like, well, I'm from there. And my friend wrote this thing and I learned a whole new thing about Appalachia.
Oh, so you weren't familiar with this group growing up.
No, the day you told me it Wired was the day I was like, I remember it because I was like, how do I not know about this?
It seems even in retrospect, I'm like, did that really happen? Because I stayed in a hotel room there for like 5 days or something. Like it felt like a lifetime almost because it was like there was nothing anywhere. I was a vegetarian at the time, so I was like going to the steakhouse like salad bars and salad bar. And it was yeah, it was very
Was this in
interesting. And then this
Tennessee?
dude yes, I was trying to remember. It was at that place where there's 3 states touch. It's like Tennessee, is it West my geography is really bad, but I think there's 3 states, there's like a corner where they all meet, and,
Like Kentucky, West Virginia,
but it
and Tennessee.
I think that's what it is, yeah. Yeah, and, because you could drive, like, 20 minutes and be in another state, um, but yeah, this guy in England was doing the study. It was just such a strange, like, gathering of people from all very different walks of life, and, like, in this group of people that was very obscure, um anyway, that's another story, but I was kind of assuming I was like, "Did we not talk about this back at Wired? Because you must have known who these people were," but I guess you did not.
I didn't. No, but you came back and asked me about it, and it was one of those like, "Oh," like, that was a moment where I was like, "Well, I don't." It was also at the beginning of my sort of Appalachia. So I grew up in Northern Appalachia, but I didn't know about my family's history until I was it'd have been I left Wired in 2002, 2003. It was a year after I left Wired. I didn't know who my family was. My parents had never told me. And I was watching the History Channel. I was editing our first book, watching Law and Order, and I had watched like 1,000 episodes. And I'm like, I'm going to watch the History Channel. And I turned it on. I shit you not. It was a TV show called Vendettas, the Clay County War, and they're like the Bakers and the Whites. And I was like, what the hell? And I called my dad and I was like, I'm watching this documentary on this war in Clay County with our family and everybody's getting killed. I'm like, are we related to them? And literally, this is what he said. There's this long pause and he goes, I guess we need to talk. And I was like,
Oh my god, that is so
yeah. I
classic.
mean, the first
Oh my
essay begins with
god.
that because I'm like, well, this needs to be, and like it turns out we were a strand of people that had escaped from there, and most of the people that didn't had been murdered and all this kind of stuff. But like, so I didn't even know, other than I was from Northern Appalachia, like how much my family was part of that. So not knowing that wasn't odd to me because I hadn't yet placed myself there.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Because you grew up in Ohio, right?
I did. I grew up in a little town called Loveland. And Loveland has 3 counties, and our county is the westernmost Appalachian county.
Oh, wow, so you're, like, just in Appalachia, sorry.
Literally, if you go across the railroad tracks in my town, you're out of Appalachia. And I've told people I legitimately lived on the wrong fucking side of the tracks.
I think I remember you saying that before. Oh my god.
Yeah. And I mean, it wasn't
Wow.
uncommon. Like, I woke up times and somebody's cows would have gotten out of their farm and they're just like cows wandering in the neighborhood. And you're just like, I mean, is somebody going to come get these things? Like, nobody's
Are you
calling
serious?
911 or anything. It's just like, oh, they got through the fence again.
House.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
And I didn't realize that
That's
wasn't normal. And then I went out in the world and I'm like, oh, that doesn't, people don't have
doesn't usually
that.
happen.
No, no.
Oh my god. Well, I know you sort of are uncomfortable with being called, like, an ally or all that stuff. I know that, but I do wanna just call that out for you because I feel like it's really important, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show is because it is really important to have men involved in feminism. And I mean, and obviously white people need to be involved in anti-racist activities. It can't be happening sort of in a vacuum. And so I know that you feel like you don't I don't know what you like don't deserve um
I can explain
the label or the
it.
what?
I said I can
E
explain it very simply. I think it's easy. Like,
Explain it. Please do.
well, one, like I said, like men are weapons, and until we figure out how to navigate the world in ways that aren't dangerous to people, like that's step, like before we even get into anything else, like that's work one for us. And if I look back on my life, like I've told people I'm quite sure I've caused damage that I don't have any idea about, just because I never had to think about it. So I'm always reticent. That's why I'm reticent when people come forward and they're like, I'm an ally and I support this stuff. Like, I was a women's studies minor when I was in college, and I did that to support my girlfriend at the time who was really involved in it. And I was like, I need to understand this stuff. But I don't think that's a thing to be lauded for. Like that's just a thing you should do, right? Like that's just, and I realize that people don't, but like that didn't make me a better person because then I had 20 years of being an asshole. And because I was dealing with my own demons and fighting my own stuff and not aware of the ways in which like white men are terrifying in this world, right? Like because we literally have no guardrails for things. We don't have repercussions for things. And so for me, it's just really important to be like, yeah, like I read Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, and I grew up with second and third wave stuff, and like I interviewed Alice Walker, and I've been around. I read bell hooks, like I've been around enough to know, okay, there's this whole other worldview to which men are not centered at all, and to which we need to be familiar with because that makes us better people. But we're still weapons. So, and I also came of age. I was saying this, I was on a radio show in Atlanta the other day, and like one of my heroes is Malcolm X. And I have in the back here, I have like all of his speeches, all of his writing, the FBI files. Like I used to have all like speeches from the Audubon Ballroom when he was starting the Organization for Afro American Unity, sort of changing from the nation. And one of the things he always said was that, initially he didn't want white people in his organizations because he thought, black leaders needed to be in spaces where they were in control of everything. And later he said, white people can be involved, but they can never be in positions of leadership for the same reason, right? And so those are the things that always resonate with me. It's like, okay, if we're a weapon and we are the dangerous ones here, that yeah, my support should be making myself less of a weapon and sort of making sure that the damages that have been caused in the past aren't both replicated in the future, and that I'm modeling for other like young men and boys like this is the way in which you should do it, right? Sort of masculinity as compassion and not masculinity as dominance. So it that I just get really uncomfortable because even if you're trying to be good, you're still a weapon, right? And it's like a chronic, being a dude is a chronic disease that you have to continually check yourself for because those checks are not in society yet. Like hopefully they get there, but like yeah,
There yeah, and I mean, I get that, but I also think that it's so important what you just said about being an example and being like a communicator, messenger, to your male friends and to young men, because we need men like you out there
yeah,
to, like you said, model and like be the type of man because you can't kind of be what you don't see. Like if you don't know, if you're not being sort of if there's not a bright light shown on the things that you might be doing to like hurt people and you don't even realize it, you can't correct it. So you being there as a person who does it, it's just really important, I think. And that's why I want to, and one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show.
yeah. And I agree that it's important. I just it is not a thing that I feel like should be lauded because at the end of the day, and I mean, I don't mean this like I'm actually a criminal, but like I am a reformed criminal, right? Like I am a reformed weapon. And so I think oftentimes we hold people up and we're like, oh my God, this person is like doing this stuff and aren't they great? And really it's like I'm a human who has gone through my own stuff to come to this realization because I was, and I'm lucky. I am a lucky one. Like my sisters, like the women in my life who are really close, they're like type A, like they don't take any kind of shit from me at all, right? So I'm this way as much because of them as anything else, because they were always like that. And even with that, still, I'm positive I've had problematic behavior. I don't know if there's a man in America that doesn't have that in their past. So that's why I'm always reticent. I'm like, yes, it is, I am doing the work now. And a better world would have been, I would have known this work needed to be done when I was 5, right? And my parents would have known that this work needed to be done when I was 5.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
I think it's really hard to sort of recognize things like that in yourself and to talk about it publicly like that. So I know you don't like it, but I'm lauding you for it. I'm lauding you for I know. Yeah, I mean, because I think about myself too. I know I've done problematic things as a white woman, as a privileged white person. I have also done problematic things, and it's hard to talk about and it's hard to think about. So, I admire you for it.
And I think part of what I'm trying to rectify in the book, and even as I talk about this stuff, is that like we're in this weird space right now where, and I think, and I can't speak for white women, but I said this to somebody the other day on the show. Like white men for the last 15 or 20 years have really been under the gun. Like, and this is not Joe Rogan, like, we'll never get to talk, but it's just like all of the problematic behavior is starting to be talked about. And we're like, holy shit, we didn't even know. We didn't even know. And so I'm lucky in the fact that like I've been part of this thing where I've gotten to see people begin to recognize that, see stuff in myself and go, yeah. And I feel like white women haven't had that same, right? Like I feel like you guys are going to get the aftermath of a lot of this stuff. We're like, why aren't you guys learning this stuff as quickly as they are? And it's like, well, first of all, it took them hundreds of years to get here. So let's calm the fuck down. And also, they were beating us down as well. Like, so there are these weird dimensions of like race and class and gender and identity. And we're trying to sort of say, well, we're only going to talk about gender as if that matters. We're only going to talk about identity as if that matters. And really, like, as a poor kid who dealt with his own trauma, who is a white man, like, there's lots of dimensions that go into like, do I get compassion here and not here? Like, where do we give people grace and
Yeah.
compassion in that? And so I think it's really easy to do in small groups. It's really hard to do in big groups because those individual stratas do matter to the people they matter to, and the multi dimensions matter to the people that the multi dimensions matter to. And so it's really hard to have meaningful conversations where you're not either injecting new hurt or seeming like you're denying what you know is wrong with yourself, right? Like that, I think, is the most difficult part of these conversations.
It's really hard to navigate. Yeah, and I think it's so important to have compassion for people. I mean, sometimes it's harder than others to have compassion, but
In my life, because of the trauma, like, I mean, you and I have talked about this. I had drug and alcohol problems for a large part of my life because I was self-medicating. Okay. So you get a grace for that as you try to fix that. And the trauma therapy has fixed that. It's still chronic, but it's changed the way I deal with it. But if within that, your own trauma, and I know that I've caused harm because I've had to make amends to people and I've had to sit down with folks. And I know I'm not even close to everybody, but like, and it's like, okay, well, maybe I get grace for that and maybe I don't, right? So like there's weird things of like, well, if this is like a mental health thing that came from a childhood trauma, should we give them grace? Even though that then spilled out onto
yeah.
other people, like, and that's why I tell like white dudes, like, we're weapons because we spill out on people. And like, if you're not able to understand your emotions, if you're not able to control them, if you're not able to access and deal with them in healthy ways, you are literally the most dangerous person in America. You're the most dangerous person. So like, for me, it just, and I don't want to keep harping on it, but like it's a chronic disease that needs to be constantly dealt with. And so I'm always very reticent to be like, yay, like I'm doing the work. Because if I stop doing the work, I'm still a weapon. Like
Mhm.
that gets loaded
Mhm.
immediately.
Mhm. Well, I think you're the one to write the book you're writing. I mean, obviously you're the one to write the book you're writing, but I'm so looking forward to reading it because it's important for I think our culture to have a book like that out in the world because I mean, I just think your point of view is really important and it's important for us to learn how to be compassionate with someone like you because you are doing the work. You know what I mean?
I do. And like, I've told people like when I was young, I wanted to be a writer and I wanted to be famous, right? And I wanted to like be a voice of a generation. And like that was every fight that I had was because that was the thing that I wanted to. And then I got to a certain point and I'm like, I'm not trained for this. I've not been schooled in this. I don't really know how to do any of this. Like I've just been fighting to get to a place without really doing any of the stuff to like prepare me when I got there. And as a 49-year-old who's trying to figure out like, okay, like where did things go off the rails? Like at this point, what I want to do is just be a good person. And like, and I think along the way, if I do that, the words will come back, right? Like I'll start to figure out what that means. Um, and to the point that I think that it is coming back because I watch things like Ted Lasso, like just utterly in tears. Like just
Wow.
I've done so many intros on the program about masculinity as kindness and masculinity as and I think that was the first time that I was able to put it in words when I saw that show because I was just like, you know, it's just not a thing that it's articulated amongst people that look and sound like me, right? Like you're supposed to take care of people, but it's like a proprietary take care of, right? It's not a like these are my people and I must protect them instead of like how do I help them become the people that they want to become? And it's a subtle difference, right? It's the difference between a
Yeah.
dad with a shotgun taking a goddamn picture with his daughter going to prom is proprietary, right? A dad taking a picture of his daughter going to prom when he's taking the picture is how can she become the best person that she can become, right? Like there's subtle different things. And I watched that show and I cried almost every episode. And it was because it felt so cathartic to go, this is the thing that I felt inside me for so long that I didn't see. And I think a lot of men have it's resonated in that way of like, oh shit, like, yeah, yeah, I want to be that guy. I don't want to be the yelly screaming. Like I want to be the other guy.
Yeah, and don't you think it's showing just people in general that masculinity doesn't have to be a certain way? It doesn't have to be, like, scary. It doesn't have to be, you know, violent or angry. Like, masculinity can be,
Like all the things that it is
you
in
know,
culture.
nurturing.
Yeah,
It yeah, it can be kind, it can be helpful. It's so cool for me to watch. I'm getting kinda teary, I don't know
yeah,
why.
because it's like it is, I mean, I was 48 when I first saw it. I was 4 years into trauma therapy. I had convinced myself that it was better that I don't date or be in a I was like, I got to figure this stuff out about myself. And like, I don't feel like it's fair to be figuring that out with other people. And then like watching this show, like the divorce episode, holy shit. I was a I
Oh,
mean, from the time that started
really
to the time
brutal.
it ended was just a ball of tears and like heaving. Just like watching that was just one of those moments of like, you know, understanding that like love is kindness and love is kindness in the face of hardness. And like that is the hardest thing in the world to do. And so I'd spent this whole life fighting my way out of this place that I was from, fighting my way out, never taking no, thinking that was the way, right? And then you get to a point and you're like, that's not the way. Like that's not the way. Like that was a way. That was the way you thought, but there's other ways. Uh, and it was weird to be 48 and like have like watching. I started tweeting Jason Sudeikis. Like we tweeted a couple times because it was like early, like a lot of people haven't watched it. And he would tweet me back, and I'm like, holy shit, like this is real. Like Ted Lasso's real.
Yeah, and he's tweeting at me.
Yeah, like this is amazing. Um, and I
Wow.
actually outlined a 10 episode Ted Lasso podcast, which I didn't do, called the Lasso Cast,
You
specifically.
can still do
I know,
it.
but I got so much other
You
stuff to
have
do.
to.
But it was
You have
literally
to do it.
it was literally about if you look at the writers' room for Ted Lasso, it's very diverse. If you look at the showrunners, it's very diverse. Like this isn't a bunch of dudes that got together to write that show. It is a show that,
It wouldn't be that show.
right. And like the women characters on that show are not out to get each other. They're not right. Like the Bechdel test gets passed regularly in that show. Like um it is just a show about friendship and compassion and love. And I'm 100%
Yeah.
positive that that show would not look the same if it was a bunch of dudes like me in that room. And that was what made me want to do the podcast was because I'm like, this is the key, guys, right? Like, this is the key. Like, your nature, I say this on the show all the time. I say this I used to run when I was a professor before I quit to take this job. I was the co-advisor for the National Association of Black Journalists at Ball State, and there's a long reason why that is. Uh, but it wasn't an accident. I was asked by my mentor to do it. My mentor is a black guy, and he was like, "He didn't ask me. He asked me in the way that he was like, 'You're going to do this.'" And I used to tell folks all the time whenever they'd ask me, I'm like, "Look, man, nature's not homogenous. I'm from nature. I grew up in the country. Like if you're living in a world that is homogenous, that is man-made and created. Like you have literally made sure there's no diversity because you can't walk through the woods and not see diversity. So if you get up in the morning and you look around and everybody looks and sounds like you and thinks like you've carved out something that is against nature. And so when I look at writing rooms like that, I always look at
I
the
love
writing
that.
rooms of shows that I like, and I'm like, okay, what does this room look like? If I and I find shows that I really resonate with, oftentimes have it may not be diverse across all the metrics, but it's not homogenous, and you just get better stuff when you do that.